Hello, early modern philosophy kiddos. Today is my practice lecture for online videos, and we're going to be talking about Berkeleyan idealism, and we're also going to be talking about Professor Carter's critical discussion of this from his book, The Elements of Metaphysics. Before I get into Carter's thoughts on Berkeleyan idealism, I think maybe we ought to do a little bit of review. In doing so, let's talk about the very nature of Berkeleyan idealism, right? As you guys should know by now, that Berkeleyan idealism, this is the view that there are no material objects in existence. According to Berkeley, the only things that exist are non-physical minds and ideas, right? And so it's also important to keep in mind, as we've talked about in class, that Berkeley's not denying the existence of trees and cells and atoms and molecules and aardvarks and mountains and tables and books. He's not denying the existence of such things. Rather, it's Berkeley's view that all those sorts of things exist. It's just that those things exist as collections of ideas in our minds or in the mind of God. None of those things is a material object. So, Berkeley's going to say that John Lamos, the human being, has arms and legs and a head. It's just his arms and legs and heads are just ideas in his mind and in the minds of those who perceive him. Now, as you know, that's a peculiar view about the fundamental nature of reality, but Berkeley does hold such a view. And the other thing that I want to talk about is what I've called the two pillars of Berkeleyan common sense. The first pillar of Berkeleyan common sense is the belief that we know lots of things about atoms, molecules, trees, mountains, tables, books. In other words, Berkeley thinks that we know all kinds of things about reality. And that's his first pillar of common sense. And that first pillar of common sense, it plays a crucial role in Berkeley's argument for idealism. In particular, Berkeley argues that given that, he says basically that given that we do know lots of things about tables, books, and mountains, it must be that tables, books, and mountains exist just as ideas in our mind. And the reasoning behind this is something like this, that, and again, we've covered all of this before, but the reasoning is something like this, that if we know about tables, books, and mountains, then we must be able to perceive tables, books, and mountains. And Berkeley says that we could only perceive those things, and we can only have justified perception of those things if they exist as ideas in our minds. Roughly, that's roughly how he makes the argument. You guys have seen a more formal expression of that argument already. Right, but anyway. The other thing is the second pillar of Berkeleyan common sense. The second pillar of Berkeleyan common sense is that things like tables, books, mountains, atoms, molecules, cells, planets, these things go on in existence even when they are unperceived by human beings or animals. So, for instance, if we leave our classroom and there are no animals and no human beings perceiving the television set in the corner of the classroom, Berkeley wants to say, well, that television set still exists. But since his view is that it could only exist if it's perceived in some being's mind, there must be some being that perceives the television set when no human or animals are perceiving it, right? And since things continue to exist when unperceived by humans or animals, and since things must be perceived to exist at all, must be perceived in some mind, and since there's an infinity of things that is unperceived by human or animal minds, it stands to reason, according to Berkeley, based on the second pillar of Berkeleyan common sense, that there must be an all-knowing, all-perceiving being that is God, that perceives the many things that are left unperceived by human or animal minds when we're not perceiving them. And so the second pillar of Berkeleyan common sense, along with the first pillar of Berkeleyan common sense, plays a crucial role in his argument that God exists as an all-knowing, all-perceiving mind. And we've walked through all of those arguments in greater detail in earlier class meetings. Now, what I wanted to do today is I want to shift gears and talk about, some thoughtful criticisms that could be made of Berkeleyan idealism. And I had you guys study a chapter from William Carter's Elements of Metaphysics. William Carter is a 20th century analytic philosopher who's written this nice little book on metaphysics, and I've taught from it before. And I've also sent you an outline for today's lecture, and I want to talk about some things that are in the outline, and I would encourage you to look at the outline as we go through some of the stuff that I'm talking about here today. But one of the things that Carter does is he presents an argument that's derived from the writings of Gottlob Frege, who's an important figure in the history of analytic philosophy and philosophy of language and metaphysics. Frege lived, I think, in the late 19th century and on into the early 20th century. And Frege has a famous sort of argument that could be made against Berkeleyan idealism. And this argument that Frege makes, it has some similarity to one of the objections that Hylas makes against Berkeleyan idealism in the third dialogue of Berkeley's dialogues between Hylas and Philonous. And Professor Carter, he even considers an objection to the Fregean argument that's akin to something that Berkeley says in response to an argument that Hylas makes. But we'll look into that a little bit more. But if you would, I would encourage you to take a look at the outline of this Fregean argument, and I want to walk through it right now. The Fregean argument, the first premise of this, as you'll see on the handout, states that according to Berkeley, if I know Lake Michigan, then Lake Michigan must be a collection of ideas in my mind. That follows straightforwardly from Berkeleyan idealism. And the second premise, as you will see, it states, but if Lake Michigan is a collection of ideas in my mind, then it's not a collection of ideas in the mind of anyone else. And the point here is that other people can only have similar but distinct ideas, right? For instance, Henry Hoytia, right? Henry, I hope you're out there watching. But anyway, Henry Hoytia might have the John Lamos idea. And then Zachary Morris might have the John Lamos idea. And Henry, his idea of John Lamos may be similar to Zach Morris's idea of John Lamos. But still, Henry's idea is one thing in his mind. Zach Morris's idea is another thing in his mind. They don't have the exact same idea. They can only at best have similar ideas. And so if Lake Michigan is a collection of ideas in my mind, then it cannot be a collection of ideas in the mind of Henry or in the mind of Zachary or in the mind of anyone else. We can only have our ideas, and those being ours must be distinct from the ideas of others, though others can have similar ideas. Now, the third premise states if Lake Michigan exists only in my mind, then no one but me can know it, because no one else can have the direct access to my idea of Lake Michigan to know it. And the fourth premise is that this is absurd, because Lake Michigan, says Frege, is one thing known by many persons. Therefore, idealism must be false, right? The idea here is that, again, if Lake Michigan is an idea in my mind, as Berkeley would have it, And since no one else could have access to the ideas in my mind to know what is Lake Michigan, um, well, then if Lake Michigan is a construction of ideas in my mind, then nobody else could know Lake Michigan. But this is absurd because Lake Michigan seems to be one thing known by many people, and hence Frege wants to say, therefore, idealism must be false. Now, on the outline that you have, you also have a possible way of defending Berkeley against this objection. And the defense that Berkeley makes against this objection, it's akin to something that Berkeley says in response to Hylas's objection of the problem of perceiving the same things, right? Hylas makes the point that if things like Lake Michigan, of course, Hylas doesn't use the example of Lake Michigan because he's writing in probably in ignorance of Lake Michigan, but regardless, but Hylas makes the point that look, if if the objects that we typically speak of, such as this table, the chair I'm sitting in, the objects that we speak of, that they're just collections of ideas in our minds, and if what we perceive is just our own ideas, then Hylas says, then it's impossible for any two human beings, any two minds to perceive the same things. I can only perceive my ideas. Laura Naide can only perceive her ideas. She can't perceive my ideas. So none of us can perceive the same things, and that does seem to be a problem. It's hard to make sense of how we could know the same things if we can't perceive the same things. And, one of the things that Berkeley says in response to this is that actually he wants to say we can perceive the same things, or at least Berkeley wants to say we can at least know the same things when our ideas of the same things map onto or correspond with God's idea of these things. So, for instance, in response to the Fregean objection, Berkeley might want to say that, look, Lake Michigan is one thing known by many people, and Berkeley might want to say Lake Michigan is one thing known by many people, insofar as the real Lake Michigan is Lake Michigan as it is perceived by God. And so, for instance, while Henry Hoytia and Zachary Morris have their own distinct ideas of Lake Michigan, well, they can still know the one thing that is Lake Michigan when their particular ideas of Lake Michigan map on to God's idea of Lake Michigan, so that Henry will know Lake Michigan when he's got accurate perceptions of the nature of Lake Michigan that correspond with God's all-knowing perception of Lake Michigan. And Zachary, who maybe has different ideas of Lake Michigan, may nonetheless know the truth about the one Lake Michigan when his ideas map up with the one thing that is Lake Michigan in the mind of God. Now, this could be said in defense of Berkeley against the Fregean argument. But what Professor Carter does is Carter turns around and he argues that this is actually a very problematic response to it's a very problematic response to the Fregean objection to Berkeleyan idealism. And personally, I think Carter makes an excellent point here. What Professor Carter does is Carter points out that Carter, he reminds us what the central argument for Berkeleyan idealism involves. The central argument for Berkeleyan idealism, it involves saying that, we can only know, for instance, that Lake Michigan, We can only know Lake Michigan insofar as Lake Michigan exists as an idea in our minds, right? If Lake Michigan is a physical object existing external to our minds, then Berkeley thinks there's no way that we could ever know whether our ideas accurately map onto the reality that is a material object, Lake Michigan, existing external to our consciousness. If Lake Michigan is a material object external to our consciousness, Berkeley says, we could never know whether our ideas accurately map up to that thing, letting us know the reality of it. But Professor Carter makes the point that if Berkeley responds to the Fregean objection by saying, oh, we know the truth about Lake Michigan when our ideas map up with God's idea of Lake Michigan, well, then we are stuck back in the very same problem that comes with saying that Lake Michigan is a material object existing external to consciousness. If we say, in answer to the Fregean argument, if we say that we know the truth about Lake Michigan when our ideas map up with God's idea of Lake Michigan, now we're back to the very same problem. Now we can't tell if our ideas accurately correspond with God's idea of Lake Michigan, and if we can't tell whether our ideas accurately correspond to God's ideas of Lake Michigan, that's the same sort of problem we have if we say that Lake Michigan is a material object. And so this way of defending Berkeley against the Fregean objection just gets him into even more hot water, taking us back to presenting the same sort of problem for which Berkeleyan idealism was originally generated to solve. And so Carter thinks that the Fregean objection really presents a serious objection. I'm inclined to think it does so as well. Now, I won't say more about that objection. What I do want to do is turn to some ideas from the 20th century metaphysician Saul Kripke. He was a metaphysician and philosopher of language. And Professor Carter does some interesting things, taking ideas from Saul Kripke's philosophy of language and metaphysics. And Carter thinks that we can use ideas from Kripke's philosophy to generate another kind of criticism of Berkeleyan idealism. Though I would say I've got some serious doubts about the merits of Carter's Kripkean argument, but it is an interesting argument and is worthy of some discussion. And I have outlined it for you on the outline for today's lecture. So if you would take a look at that and let's walk through this. The argument runs something like this. According to Kripke, genuine water is the compound of hydrogen and oxygen that we call H2O. Kripke would argue that if that's true, then it is necessarily true that genuine water is H2O. Right? And what Kripke's suggesting here is that for something X to be water, it must be H2O. Right? And regarding that second premise, which you've got on the outline, I think what's on Kripke's mind here is that if you were to encounter a clear liquid that tastes like water, that you could drink, that would hydrate you, that you could swim in, that boats could float on, and that you could clean with, if you were to encounter, according to Kripke, if you were to encounter something that looks and functions just like what we call water, and that clear liquid was in fact something with a complex molecular structure, call it XYZ if you like, Kripke would say that clear liquid that functions in all the same way as what we call water, it would not be water unless it were H2O. If it had a very different molecular structure, we might say that it's fool's water, just as I think it's pyrite that we call fool's gold is not really gold, but it looks for all the world like gold. Well, so too, some clear liquid that we could drink and swim in and clean with, it would not be water unless it actually had the atomic structure or the molecular structure of H2O. And again, Kripke wants to say, again, going back to the outline, one, genuine water is a compound of H2O. If that's true, then it's necessarily true that genuine water is H2O. And then the point could be made, as Carter makes, but three, if something must be H2O to be water, it cannot be water. It cannot be that water is a collection of ideas. Therefore, Berkeleyan idealism is false. Right? The idea here is that if water is essentially H2O, then water cannot be a collection of ideas. But of course, Berkeleyan idealism commits us to the notion that water is a collection of ideas, and therefore it must be, according to this Kripkean argument, which Carter constructs, it must be that Berkeleyan idealism is false. Now, as I said, I find the argument kind of interesting. But I've read Carter's book many times, but I'm often led to think that it seems to me Berkeley could respond to this. I mean, let's walk back through this. Let's just consider how Berkeley could answer, or a friend of Berkeley could answer, the Kripkean argument that Carter has made against it. Premise one, right? It says genuine water is a compound of hydrogen and oxygen, also known as H2O. Quite frankly, I think Berkeley would agree with that. Genuine water is a compound of H2O. Second premise says, well, if that's true, if that's true, then it is necessarily true that genuine water is H2O. In other words, for something X to be water, it must be H2O. I think Berkeley would actually agree with that. It's important to keep in mind that Berkeley's not, as we've said in here, he's not an enemy of science. I think Berkeley would be the first to admit that water is a compound of hydrogen and oxygen and has a molecular structure known as H2O. So I think Berkeley's going to accept both of those premises. Now, the third premise says if something must be H2O to be water, it cannot be that water is a collection of ideas. Right? Now, that premise, I think Berkeley's going to reject that premise. And I think Berkeley's going to say that, I think he's going to say that even if something must be H2O to be water, it can still be the case that water is a collection of ideas. And now you might ask, well, how is that? If water is composed of hydrogen and oxygen, how can it be a collection of ideas? And I think Berkeley's simply going to say that those things that we call hydrogen and oxygen, those things are themselves collections of ideas. Hydrogen's just an idea in our mind. Oxygen's just an idea in our mind. The molecular formula, H2O, is just an idea in our mind. Now, and I think Berkeley's going to agree with the first and the second premises, and I think he's going to say that water is necessarily H2O. But Berkeley's going to understand that as consistent with the claim that water is a collection of ideas in our mind. Water, which is an idea, contains within it the ideas of hydrogen and oxygen, which are themselves ideas, right? And we incline to say that water is H2O, but on Berkeley's view, that's consistent with saying there's no material stuff, and it's also consistent with saying that water is a collection of ideas in our mind. Water is made up of the hydrogen and oxygen ideas. So anyway, the Kripkean objection, it does seem to me to be an interesting one, but I think it fails, whereas I do think that the Fregean argument has got some teeth, and I think Carter does a nice job presenting a possible answer to the Fregean objection that Berkeley might make. I think we do see Berkeley make a similar kind of reply to the problem of perceiving the same things, which Hylas presents in the third dialogue. But the Berkeleyan response to Hylas on the problem of perceiving the same things, and the Berkeleyan response that could be made to the Phrygian objection, I do think that they both put Berkeley in hot water. I mean, again, Berkeleyan idealism was created to show how, well, it was created to show how we can know things like Lake Michigan only insofar as they are ideas in our mind. Right? I can know Lake Michigan insofar as Lake Michigan is an idea in my mind. This seems to be what Berkeley's pushing. I can know John Lamos insofar as John Lamos is an idea in my mind. Right? But then that leads you into the problem of how we could ever know the same things, since the ideas in my mind are one set of ideas, the ideas in Henry's mind is another set of ideas, the ideas in Zach's mind is another set of ideas. And it seems that for scientific understanding of the world to operate, we have to be able to know the same things. We have to be able to have multiple people knowing the same things. And so if we're going to say that things are collections of ideas in our minds, and how is it that we know the same things? And Berkeley says, oh, well, we know the same things when our ideas and our knowledge of things maps up with God's knowledge and perception of things. But then we're back to the same problem that materialism has. Materialism has a problem of saying, how can we know a material object existing external to our minds if we can only know the ideas in our minds? Well, now we're stuck with the same problem. If we ground reality in God's idea of things, then we run into the problem of how we can know that reality, which is in God's mind, given that we only have immediate access to the idea of things as they exist in our minds. It just seemed back to the same problem that motivated the turn away from materialism and over to idealism. But now we seem to be caught in the same problem. And so it seems to me the Phrygian objection is a serious problem. Anyway, I hope this has been informative. Hope you found this useful. Next time we meet, we'll be talking about David Hume and his inquiry concerning human understanding. I want you guys to read the first 3 sections, the first 3 chapters, he calls them sections, of David Hume's famous treatise. Over and out. Have a good day. Bye-bye.